Hey everybody, how's it going? Max with BuzzTox here, and I am back with a Westworld Season 2, Episode 3 breakdown video. In this video, I'm going to go through Episode 3 in its entirety, so we understand all the scenes that took place, as well as theorize and predict what's next to come. And first off, this episode starts with a dramatic opener, and that's the introduction to Rajworld. And this world is based in India, and we get introduced to two key characters, a woman named Grace and a man named Nicholas. Now, I want to say, off first impressions, I was surprised to read online that a lot of people had the same impression that I did. She reminded me a lot of Teresa. Just the way in which she acted, I thought it was really fascinating. But I want to say I do not think this is the case. I do not think that she's a young Teresa host, because that plot wouldn't go anywhere and it wouldn't really mean anything. One thing I did read that I didn't come up with that I found in the comment section down below is that Grace could be William's daughter. And now I'm at the point where I'm 100% convinced that she actually is William's daughter, because it adds a lot of stakes and meaning to the story.
And then at the funeral, I tried to console my daughter. She pushed me away, told me that my wife's death was no accident, that she killed herself because of me. Emily said that every day with me had been sheer terror. Any point I could blow up or collapse, like some dark star.
Did you hurt them too?
Never.
In Season 1, we were introduced to the tragic story of William, how his wife killed herself, and his daughter never really forgave him. And just the fact that they introduced that story between William and his daughter in Season 1, to me means that we're going to be able to see the next chapter of that unravel in Season 2. And we've already seen steps in this season to introduce the viewing audience to William's daughter. We see her interact with Dolores and go back to William. And that is a key way as a showrunner to introduce the audience to the concept of William's daughter, because they probably forgot that William talked about her in the last season. For those key reasons that they introduced her previously, I think she will be returning in this season. And even looking at her character synopsis, Grace is supposed to be a very well-versed park goer. She's supposed to be very experienced. And that makes a lot of sense because her father owns the parks. So she would naturally go in a lot, probably because it's free, and because it was such a deep part of her childhood. Another thing is her age. Her age perfectly aligns with the age that she would have been. But the most important thing that I think goes in with my theory is the stakes it brings to the story. When I made my video, The Door to Dolores, I came up with a theory that pretty much states that William is pursuing the door to consciousness. That Ford designed this storyline specifically for William so he can transcend his body from a human to a host. And in developing that theory, one thing in the back of my mind that kept saying he might not do it is the love for his daughter. That is the only real thing that he has in the real world, is that love from his daughter. So it seems like she could provide a lot of stakes to William's storyline. And I think when or if we see Grace interact with her father, William, they could almost discover that they're not so different and her anger wasn't as well-founded as she thought. Because we see a part of William in her. She has a little aggression to her when she brings Nicholas into her apartment and shoots him to prove that he is in fact a human. And I was pretty surprised when they both got attacked by that host. The fact that he says violent delights have violent ends points to the fact that all of these parks have reveries, and all of these parks are going out of control. So that kind of goes against my initial theory that the reveries update was specific to Westworld. And I thought Mave was going to be the one to transfer consciousness into Shogun World. But that seems like that's not going to be the case. It seems like all hosts are uprising in every park. But after she kills him and makes her way out, she gets attacked by a tiger. And they end up winding up back on the beach, and that explains why the tiger was found on the shores of Westworld. What we see happen to Grace is that she seemingly gets captured by natives. And these natives are called the Ghost Nation. And what I want to say here is the key word is taken. These natives don't seem initially aggressive, like how they're portrayed in some scenes. Like how they capture Ashley, how they just want to take Sizemore, they don't want to harm him. And how they appear over Grace without directly harming her. It really starts to seem like these natives are capturing humans rather than killing them. And they're not doing it like Rebus, who are handing it off to Confederados. They're doing it on their own accord. And another key facet to these natives is that they do not get controlled by functions. Even in Season 1, Ashley couldn't control these natives, and Mave couldn't either in this episode. So there are multiple theories out there that I'm not really looking to subscribe to, I read in the comment section that Elsie could still be alive, and she reprogrammed the hosts, much like how Bernard reprogrammed Rebus, to specifically go out and capture humans, to keep them safe. While it's an interesting theory, I don't necessarily think it's true. But I think there is a lot to be said about these natives collecting humans and keeping them from harm. That would explain Ashley being safe and being able to collect Bernard from the beach in the first episode. I'm not willing to subscribe to a theory yet, but my general idea right now is potentially Ford, which doesn't make any sense because he clearly wants the host to be free. But in the first season, we see the natives carrying around a doll, and the doll represents the humans that walk between worlds, the ones that operate on the hosts. So it shows even early on when Ford was developing his storyline, he made all of these natives worship humans like a god. And I think that worship that they've been programmed to do has almost been transferred into their capturing of stray humans in the park. But I think what they do with those humans is left to be answered. And I think that could shed some more light on Ford's actual storyline. But all I'm confident to say is that we're going to see Grace be taken by the natives, and she may stumble across Ashley. Based on the fact that we know that Ashley escapes, I'm pretty sure that we're going to see Grace escape also. And knowing that Dolores ends up shooting some natives on the beach because they don't deserve to make it to the valley beyond, shows that Grace may end up in the hands of Dolores. And Dolores may have shot the native in the first place because they are rescuing humans. They go against Dolores' mission to eliminate the humans and rise up as a new species. But that takes us to the present. And it's the next chapter in Bernard's story. We see him wake up on the beach. He goes back to the gala. He sees a tiger and a pool of hosts laying in the water. And now he finally makes it back to headquarters. And we see him reunite with Charlotte. And she's surprised that he's alive. And what we learn here in that 2 weeks is that Charlotte asks about Abernathy, that he keeps slipping out of her fingers. She can't get access to him. And this is where Charlotte asks Bernard where he thinks Abernathy could be, because he keeps slipping out of their hands. And what this tells us is that Abernathy's going to slip out of Charlotte's hands again. 2 weeks in the past, we see Charlotte and Bernard pursue Abernathy. And then we see Charlotte take Abernathy after she lays Dolores' fort under attack. This tells us that after she captured Bernard, he's going to slip out of her hands again. And it could be because Dolores' men and Bernard go back and rescue him. And the way Charlotte acts around Bernard seems like she's very suspicious and she knows that Bernard is a host. We've seen in the trailers that she's standing amongst a lot of printed Bernards. And I think she makes this discovery after she separates from Bernard. And that leads to this point in the present where she is very suspicious of him. And at this point, I believe she's questioning his motives. And she's talking to him and questioning him the way that she is because she wants to evaluate where he's at. And she wants to know what side he's fighting for. But the very fact that Charlotte mentions Abernathy starts striking reveries back into Bernard. And it's these key phrases that activates these reveries that allows him to access the past. And that's why we're jumping between timelines, because Bernard's journey to consciousness is the jump between timelines until he realizes it and pieces it together, just as Dolores did in season 1. And then the rest of the episode entirely takes place in between the 2 weeks when the gala is shot up and when Bernard wakes on the beach. We see Bernard and Charlotte try and rescue Abernathy. They try and do that by recalibrating Rebus, and that is a plot point that proves that you have to pay attention to Westworld, because even in episode 1, we see Rebus acting out of character. And that's because Bernard altered his character to be the most virtuous, compassionate guy out there. And when Bernard and Charlotte finally get to Abernathy, he's unstable because he's jumping between personalities. The reason why he didn't go with them is because he was his old Shakespearean cannibal character, where he refuses to give up and to stand down. And because of this is where Bernard and Charlotte get separated. And this is where Bernard goes on his adventure to Dolores, and Charlotte gets rescued by the military. And we see when Charlotte arrives to the military, and she knows immediately where Dolores is, Fort Forlorn Hope. And I think that's because she knows that Rebus was keeping these guests to bring to the Confederados. And she knows that the Confederados fort is in that area. So I think she had a strong suspicion that Abernathy would be at that fort. But then we see Bernard actually arrive at the fort. But before we see Bernard arrive, we see Dolores actually gain favor with the commander to allow her to get access to the fort. She shows the general the humans and the guns that they have. And she also calls herself Wyatt, which is actually recognized by the general of the Confederados. And what I want to say is a lot of people in the community feel like Dolores is falling back into her Wyatt storyline, and I strongly disagree. That assumption assumes that Dolores is not conscious, which is something that Season 1 has proved not to be true. The whole basis of Season 1 was her achieving the maze, and we see her do that when she talks to her own self, her inner voice. And that's how the story Journey into the Night was started. It was done by the shooting being done by choice, Dolores' choice. Wyatt's character was based on him being delusional because he understood God, and that he fights for something that's left to come. And that's a natural story that's written because of the situation Dolores is in. She's achieved consciousness, therefore she knows the creators. She knows who created them. And she understands what she has to do for everyone to be free. And the thing that she's fighting that's left to come is when these hosts start discovering themselves. She clearly uses Wyatt as a name of strategy. Every time she wants to be intimidating and gain favor with the hosts, she uses the name Wyatt, because all of these hosts are programmed to know who Wyatt is, that he's a very formidable villain. That's why the Confederado knows who Wyatt is. He was programmed to. And Dolores leverages that name to gain respect, that she's a commander. If she calls herself Dolores, the girl from Sweetwater, no one would take her seriously. And that's the game Dolores has to play. In order to get these mindless hosts to follow her, she has to play by their rules. And that reflects on how she feels about the hosts. When riding into the camp, Teddy calls all of these people animals. And Dolores just tells Teddy that they're children because they don't know any better. And because of that, they need to be led by her. And that just speaks to their misunderstanding of the real world out there. They're still operating on their Western code, whereas Dolores is operating on a whole other level. She knows how they were created. She knows the other world that exists outside of their own. And in this talk, she tells Teddy to trust her. And I think that's because she doesn't want to lose Teddy. She knows that she's doing horrible things. And she doesn't want to lose Teddy along the way. Because I think she has a fear that Teddy himself is a child and doesn't understand the bigger picture. And then in another scene, we see Bernard and Abernathy arrive at the fort. And we see a very negative interaction between Bernard and Dolores. The last time they saw each other, Bernard was the one to help push Dolores to that conscious state. But I think Dolores' anger is a bit misplaced. I think she looks upon Bernard as a reminder of how great Arnold was, and how Bernard just isn't that person. She's almost like disappointed that it's not the real Arnold. While Bernard seems to get angry with Dolores, and his anger is a bit more justified. And I'll get into that later. But after this, we see Dolores finally interact with her father, Abernathy, and I absolutely love this scene. Teddy doesn't even remember who Abernathy is. And we see Dolores get a bit upset because she's afraid she's going to lose her father. And she tells Teddy that he is all she has left. And now in the past, I made arguments about Mave not being conscious because she's pursuing her daughter. This, in a sense, discredits my thoughts on that, but I want to dive deeper and show you the true differences between Mave and Dolores. Dolores having such a deep connection with Teddy and her father makes sense. Dolores' whole existence has been her living on the ranch with Abernathy as her father, and Teddy being the charming love that she never really gets to see. She's now conscious, but she still has all of those memories, and she shared those experiences with Abernathy and Teddy, and she refuses to let them go because that's a part of who she is. It's like me personally. I am who I am as a person because of all the past memories I have that make me myself. And Dolores is the same. Even though Abernathy was programmed to be her dad, and Teddy was programmed to be her boyfriend, they are still very significant parts in her past that she looks back upon. And I guess you could say the exact same thing for Mave and her daughter. What I will say with Mave, however, is she's jumped between more storylines. And her latest storyline was her being a brothel keeper. But the key difference between Dolores and Mave, I think, is that Mave jumps between timelines. In the last season, Dolores was jumping between timelines because she wasn't conscious yet. But now she sees very clearly. She doesn't have snaps of the past anymore. Whereas with Mave, even in this episode, we saw Mave see something and it brought her back to a moment that she had. It's the mixture of timelines that brings one to consciousness. And even Bernard is going through that. Mave seeing that native and jumping back to her traumatic experience was exactly like Dolores shooting the gun for the first time, which jump-started her onto her root of consciousness. That man was coming to get her, and it was the traumatic experience of the man in black that allowed her to pull the trigger. It's the mixture between timelines that allows one to pursue consciousness. And another thing we see is that Mave hasn't entirely broken out of her coding. We see a scene with Mave, Hector, and Sizemore, and he's upset because he doesn't think that Mave and Hector are supposed to be together because they were never programmed to be together. We know that hosts can somewhat make their own decisions, as Hector decided after he learned that he was fake that he was going to pursue Mave and break out of that storyline. However, they haven't shaken it completely because Sizemore finishes his sentence. They're still following the scripts that are written for them. And Sizemore even does this to Mave in episode 1.
You were going to out me.
No, I swear.
If you try something like that again, I will relieve you of your most precious organ and feed it to you. Though it won't make much of a meal.
I wrote that line for you.
So that is proof in itself that no matter how conscious Mave acts, she's still following a script. And she's still following the code of her character as Mave. But she's in the situation of being free. But anyways, we go back to my favorite scene of this entire episode, and that is Dolores taking care of Abernathy. I honestly think every scene Abernathy's in becomes my favorite scene in the entire show. We see him snap to finally being himself again, and Dolores and her father reminisce about the farm, and Dolores ends up confiding in her father. Because I feel like no matter how strong Dolores acts, and how she's acting as this revolutionary, she realizes that's what she has to do and that's the role she was given. But at the same time, she still wants to be loved and she still feels vulnerable and she wants somebody to confide in. And I think Dolores is on that path where she's realizing how alone she actually is. She's operating on a different plane than everybody else in this park. It's like being in a zoo with a bunch of monkeys. You know the world outside, and you can see the bigger picture, whereas these monkeys just see the habitat that was created for them. And I think this scene between Abernathy and Dolores just shows how deep their connection is. In season 1, Abernathy broke his code because of the love he had for his daughter. His code to ignore the picture conflicted with the love he had for Dolores. And Abernathy seemed to be on the right path to consciousness, going down the road of the maze, except he was decommissioned and messed up with the storyline he was bogged down in to transfer Delos data. But one key thing I find very interesting with Abernathy is that either Sizemore did an awful job giving him a storyline, or he's jumping between storylines because he is in fact on the route to consciousness. I find it hard to believe that Sizemore would create such an inadequate storyline that he would be jumping between his Shakespearean character, his Peter Abernathy character, and his Train character. We see Abernathy jump between these roles and then eventually jumping into his current role that Sizemore gave him, where he says, I have to get to the train, I have to get to the train. So I think there's more going on with Peter Abernathy's character rather than Sizemore just breaking him. So hopefully Abernathy can look at all of his timelines and all these characters and start piecing it together to form himself. And I think the real realization comes in that Dolores is alone when she tries to confide in her father, and she hopes that her father can see what she sees. Except all Abernathy says is that he wants to go home, which proves that he's not operating at the same level of Dolores. And it's nice to see a scene like this where she becomes so vulnerable, because it shows that Dolores is still a lovable character. We see her do all these ruthless things and start to treat these guests like dogs. And I think what we'll find out is that's just a mask she's using to get what she wants. She knows that the others don't see what she sees. They're not conscious yet. So she has to be ruthless. She has to be the Judas steer to lead them to the slaughter so they could potentially achieve consciousness. And I think this episode she realized that even Teddy is in that boat. But Dolores has such a love for her father that she goes to Bernard. And in this scene, Bernard seems very annoyed and upset with Dolores. And I think it's because Bernard is having self-identity issues, because he doesn't agree with the violence that Dolores is causing, killing all these humans. Because he's been programmed to be a human for so long, and he's been taking care of these hosts. So naturally he's very conflicted between human and host. And Dolores even makes Bernard look so uneducated and small because he's never actually been in the real world. He's never seen anything outside of headquarters in Westworld. But Bernard agrees to take care of Abernathy, and that goes to the war that ensues. Bernard ends up breaking Abernathy's encryption, and he's obviously very shocked by what he sees.
Oh my God.
And the most important thing is that he's offered to use a one-time key. First of all, this one-time key really could mean nothing. But it could also mean that Bernard hacked into this data. And because this data is so valuable and so vital, it has a one-time view encryption, where when Delos receives Abernathy, they see the data, they transfer it, and then they delete it off Abernathy in order to keep that data secure and safe. So it's a very strong possibility that Bernard is and will only be the one person who sees this data. And the fact that Bernard knows this valuable data will have huge stakes on what he does moving forward in the story, I'm sure. But the key question is, what did Bernard see? I would have to say that it is much more than just guest experiences and DNA. Because Bernard knew that that was happening in episode 1. And that wouldn't have necessarily surprised him the way he was surprised finding this information. I think on top of the DNA and guest experiences, I think Bernard found what William was after. The actual real reason for starting the park that Dolores claims that she knows, and what William knows, and the weapon she wants to exploit. And I believe what that secret was that William was pursuing was immortality. I'm pretty sure that Bernard, in that data that he's seen, he has access to Arnold's DNA, to Ford's DNA, to Jim's DNA, and many others. And they can be accessed and reprinted, and that would be a form of immortality. And this can be heavily weaponized and can be used for Dolores. And it can also be used for Ford's storyline that he has created specifically for William to pursue the door of transcendence. If you want to know more about that, check out my video on the door to Dolores. And we've gotten many hints throughout this season.
But no, mate. Our arrangement's been a perfect fit. You stepping down doesn't help me at all.
Not me. And I was told I may not have to.
Well, things are progressing, but we'll all need a little patience.
Yeah, well, some of us can afford to have more patience than others.
The reason why Jim thinks he might not have to retire is because of the potential of immortality. And that's why they talk of patience. William says it will take patience for them to develop this technology. Where Jim says some of us can't afford to have as much patience as others, because he's clearly sick and he's on his deathbed. And he wants that immortality to work. And he wants that technology to be immortal, where he doesn't have to retire. And that goes deep in what the Man in Black talks about. How they got to tally up guest sins, but judgment wasn't the point. They had something else in mind entirely. And what that was, is using Westworld as a reflection to learn who these people are. So they can use that data and reprint and recreate. And this theory of the secret to Westworld being immortality works great for Bernard and his storyline. During the gala and all of Bernard's experiences, he's having severe brain trauma. And he's very unstable, and he could die at any moment. But when he wakes up on the beach after the 2 weeks, he's not shaking anymore, and he seems almost shocked that he isn't shaking. And then we see visions that have him piece together his past and what happened. And one key thing is, in these visions, we see Arnold. And what that tells us is that Bernard's past is far beyond himself, and now transfers on to Arnold. So it seems like they share a deep connection. So I think Bernard realizes that his body is a ticking time bomb. And now that he knows he has Arnold's DNA, he can use that to reprint himself a new body. A new body that has the memories of Arnold as well as himself. And it will be easier for Bernard to create his own sense of self now. He'll no longer be a character with a narrative that he speaks of. And it goes against what Dolores said earlier, almost as an Easter egg.
I wonder if there's any of him in you.
I was given a character, a story, and a function to serve, like you.
It's a good hint because right now he's not a lot like Arnold. But in the future, he will be a reprinted version of him. And now Bernard knows the most valuable information of Westworld. And based on his memories, we know he's going to go on an adventure to the control center and shoot it up. And I'm sure he's going to do multiple things. And while he's at headquarters, he'll have access to resources where he could reprint himself. We even see in the flashback him looking at a skeleton. That could be his own self that he's reprinting, because his body's no longer stable and can sustain him. But after this discovery, they end up taking Abernathy. Bernard is in brutal condition, and Dolores makes it her mission to try and rescue Abernathy. She takes a couple shots, but they end up escaping. So Dolores says Teddy split up their horde and not stop until they find Abernathy again. She ends up telling Teddy that they're going to go to Sweetwater because there's something that she needs there. And to be honest, this is the one thing where I am really uncertain about. I don't know what she's after, but it could be a couple things. It seems like we'll see Dolores and Teddy go to Sweetwater, while Bernard, Clementine, and Dolores' men go to the control center. But I think Dolores and Sweetwater could look for multiple things. First of all, it could be a room where she used to talk to Arnold. There are multiple places like that amongst the park where Arnold could sit down and talk to Dolores. Another thing which I'm not really sure about is memories. It is such a staple part of their existence, and she may want to take Teddy and some other significant characters there to try and jog the reveries. But other than that, I'm not 100% certain, because Sweetwater is going to be an empty shell when they arrive. And during this fight, we see Dolores get a little ruthless. She uses all the Confederados as bait, and she ends up defeating the humans. Obviously, the guy who sided with her was very upset, but Dolores makes it clear and tells him that he doesn't deserve to make it. And Dolores tells him that not everyone deserves to make it, and I assume she's talking about the Great Valley Beyond. So what I'm interested in is, what is her criteria in who deserves to make it to the Great Valley Beyond? I initially thought it was the longevity of the host. The older they are, the more reveries they have, the more likely they are to become conscious. But now seeing her relationship with Teddy, I think there is even more that she's following. But I honestly think this is Dolores being that Judas steer. She tells Teddy to take the dog and let him die like the rest of them, because she doesn't see them as worth it to be in the Great Valley Beyond. And I think she's being that Judas steer. She is leading all of them to the slaughter. Just like the credits, you see the bull falling. There is a fall to consciousness, a suffering to consciousness. And it's the slaughter. They have to die to get there. It's like Dolores' past. It's live, die, repeat, live, die, repeat. And Dolores is recreating that for all of the hosts. And what's funny is how badly she treats the hosts. She calls them children. She calls them dogs. She doesn't see them as good enough because they're not conscious like herself. And that in itself is very human. She's behaving exactly like every other human. They treat the host the way they do because they're not real. Dolores was raped. She was killed multiple times throughout her experience at Westworld because nobody saw her as real. She was a thing. And that's how Dolores is seeing everybody else now, as things. But I think that's the role she has to take. She has to be that human figure, that conscious figure, to push everybody to consciousness. Because that's the treatment that she received that allowed her to reach her own consciousness. And we know that no matter how many bad things Dolores does, the good part of her is still there. We just have to look at her interaction with her father. And another key reason she sees them as dogs and not good enough is simply because their thoughts aren't real, they're programmed. And that's the same slope humans feel. That's how William feels. He thought he'd play the villain because there were no stakes. The hosts were not real. They could just be resurrected and brought back and made to forget everything. So it's interesting to see Dolores' turn against these hosts. And she is becoming a Man in Black figure. But it's grounded in the fact that she knows that they're not real, they're programmed not to be real, and she must be that Judas steer human figure to bring them to consciousness. And that's where I believe Dolores gets a bit disappointed. She tells Teddy to go shoot him, and Teddy gets convinced not to. Teddy tries to project and calls him a child, and he's just pushing what Dolores has been telling him. But the truth is, Teddy couldn't kill him, and he made a choice to set him free. And this is where Dolores looks upon Teddy with almost sadness and disappointment. And that's the struggle with Dolores, where she feels like Teddy's the only one that she has left, but she's realizing that Teddy's not operating at her level. She wanted that guy to die because that's the journey to consciousness. And with this interaction, I disagree with the majority. A lot of people think Teddy made this decision. It was him disobeying Dolores. And what I would say is that Teddy fought and stayed true to the character that he was programmed to be. He let him free because he doesn't see the stakes that Dolores sees. Teddy doesn't see an unconscious host. He sees just another person. Because Dolores has disconnected herself emotionally from everybody because she knows that they haven't reached consciousness yet. They're not real. And it's her job to bring them there. Whereas Teddy can't understand that. He can't grasp it. All he sees is that he's doing these awful things to good people. And that's where he refused to follow Dolores' orders, because he doesn't see her vision. He doesn't understand the Great Valley Beyond. And that's why this proves that Teddy's a child, and that shows why Dolores is upset. Because it shows that Teddy isn't there either. And she may be hoping that he is good enough to make it to the Valley Beyond. But after this interaction, we get a look at a key landscape. And I think we see this in Season 1. This is the valley where we see William and Dolores make it to. It's the place she always dreamed of going, the painting that she always painted. And I think this has true significance to where she wants to go.
Careful. You're heading west across that river. You may be leaving the fight behind, or you're gonna be in unclaimed territories. Watch out that way. You're gonna have to ask the dust. Ain't nothing ever come back from there.
Because I know at daybreak you're headed to link up with the rest of your army. And then you're finally headed west to seek out that little patch of land you've been talking about, but have never been brave enough to take.
You're headed to the pearly gates. Don't we gotta die to get there?
Nope. 3 days ride due west.
It's such a far journey, and it's so big that nobody knows where that leads to. And I think this is the Great Valley Beyond, and we saw it in season 1. And I think on William's journey with Dolores, he fell in love with her. So this facility that he built, that he showed her, he built it just beyond that Great Valley. The place where he went with Dolores, where he fell in love. So I believe in this season, we're going to see more and more connections between William and his past with Dolores. And that Great Valley Beyond is just a valley that stems from William's love for Dolores. And finally, I just want to talk about Mave's storyline. I gotta be honest, this is the one storyline I'm never really excited to watch. But I did like this episode since we saw Armistice, Sylvester, and Felix make a return. We see Armistice with a fake arm. Sylvester and Felix probably made it for her, since she lost it in season 1. They end up leaving and going to the surface, and they walk amongst snow. But what Sizemore says is surprising is that he says they're in the most northern part of the park. And he tells her that they're 3 or 4 sectors away from the homestead where her daughter's located. But the problem is that they find a samurai head and they get attacked. So I gotta be honest, I'm not 100% sure whether they're in Shogun World or whether the samurais have made their way into Westworld. So I'm going to assume that samurai have actually broken free and made their way into Westworld. So it'll be interesting to see in the future where these samurai are at in their level of consciousness. Are they saying violent delights have violent ends? Or is it just another thing that Mave is going to have to fight to get to her daughter? But that is it, everybody. Please let me know what you think in the comment section down below. I'd love to hear your theories and thoughts on this episode, as well as what you think will happen in the future. But anyways, until next time, I'll see you guys later.